The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown as a well-dressed businessman hurried through the crowd, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the pavement. At 52, Richard Chen had built his real estate empire from scratch, but lately, the weight of success felt more like a burden than an achievement. That crisp autumn morning started like any other. Richard was running late for an important meeting, his mind preoccupied with the latest development project that threatened to fall through. As he rounded the corner near Central Park, his foot caught on an uneven piece of sidewalk. The world tilted sideways as he stumbled, his briefcase flying from his grip. What happened next would change his life forever. Before his head could hit the concrete, a pair of weathered hands caught him, breaking his fall. The hands belonged to a woman in her mid-40s, wearing layers of worn-out clothes. Her face, though lined with hardship, held a gentle warmth that caught Richard off guard. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, helping him regain his balance. Her voice carried a hint of concern that felt genuine, unlike the practiced politeness he was used to in his corporate world. "I'm fine, thank you," Richard replied, brushing off his suit. As he reached for his briefcase, a sharp pain shot through his left arm. The woman noticed his wince and immediately sprang into action. Without hesitation, she retrieved his briefcase and pulled out her own worn backpack, producing a small first aid kit. "You might have sprained your wrist in the fall," she said, carefully examining his arm. "I used to be a nurse, before everything changed." Her words trailed off as she efficiently wrapped his wrist with a bandage from her kit. Richard stood there, stunned by the contrast between her current situation and her evident medical knowledge. As she worked, he noticed how other pedestrians gave them a wide berth, some throwing disapproving glances their way. But for the first time in years, Richard didn't care about appearances. "I'm Richard," he introduced himself, realizing he hadn't properly thanked his rescuer. The woman hesitated for a moment before responding, "People around here call me Angel." She gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Because I tend to help people when they fall, literally and figuratively." As Angel finished wrapping his wrist, Richard noticed a small notebook peeking out of her backpack. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting, diagrams, and what appeared to be medication lists. Before he could ask about it, his phone buzzed insistently, the meeting he was already late for. "I have to go," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Please, let me." Angel shook her head firmly. "Keep your money, sir. Just be careful with that wrist for a few days." She gathered her things, ready to disappear back into the crowd. But something made Richard pause. In that brief interaction, he'd glimpsed something that didn't add up. How did a former nurse end up on the streets? Why did she still carry a first aid kit and medical notes? The mystery tugged at his mind, even as he hurried toward his office building. Throughout his meeting, Richard found himself distracted. While his colleagues discussed profit margins and investment returns, his thoughts kept drifting back to Angel. In his 30 years of business, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and something about her story called to him. As the day drew to a close, Richard made a decision. Instead of heading straight home, he retraced his steps to the spot where he'd fallen. The streets were quieter now, the evening crowd thinning out. He searched the area, hoping to find Angel again, but she was nowhere to be seen. A street vendor who'd witnessed their morning encounter noticed his searching looks. "The lady you're looking for? She usually helps out at the soup kitchen 3 blocks down," he offered, pointing toward an old church building in the distance. Richard thanked him and started walking. His expensive suit felt out of place in this part of town, but for once, he didn't mind. As he approached the church, he could see a small group of people gathered outside. Among them, he spotted Angel, distributing soup with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown while bandaging his wrist. What he didn't expect to see was how she interacted with everyone around her. Despite her own circumstances, she checked on elderly homeless individuals, ensuring they had warm spots to sit. She gently cleaned a child's scraped knee while his mother, clearly exhausted from a long day's work, gratefully accepted a bowl of soup. Richard stood in the shadows, observing. In all his years of charitable giving and tax-deductible donations, he'd never witnessed such genuine care in action. Here was someone who had nothing in material terms, yet gave everything in human connection and compassion. As the soup kitchen began to close for the night, Richard stepped forward. Angel looked surprised to see him but didn't comment on his presence. Instead, she continued helping to clean up, her movements betraying a slight fatigue that she tried to hide. "Would you join me for coffee?" Richard asked, gesturing to a small diner across the street that was still open. "I'd like to properly thank you for this morning." He touched his bandaged wrist, now serving as a reminder of their chance encounter. Angel hesitated, looking down at her worn clothes, then back at Richard's expensive suit. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said softly. "People might get the wrong impression." "Let them," Richard replied with a conviction that surprised even himself. Sometimes the wrong impressions lead to the right conversations. The small diner's bell chimed as Richard and Angel stepped inside. The warmth of the place was a stark contrast to the cooling evening air outside. A few late-night customers glanced their way. But the elderly waitress simply smiled and gestured them toward a quiet booth in the corner. Angel sat down carefully, her weathered hands folded neatly on the table. The fluorescent lights revealed details Richard hadn't noticed earlier, a small scar above her eyebrow, reading glasses hanging from a string around her neck, and most notably, a wedding ring worn smooth with age, still sitting on her finger. "2 coffees, please," Richard ordered when the waitress approached. "And whatever my friend would like to eat." He noticed how Angel's eyes lingered on the menu prices, her discomfort visible despite her attempt to hide it. "Just coffee is fine," she insisted, but Richard shook his head. "You saved me from a nasty fall this morning and probably a concussion. The least I can do is buy you dinner." His tone was gentle but firm. After a moment's hesitation, Angel ordered a simple grilled cheese sandwich. As they waited for their order, Richard noticed how Angel's eyes kept darting to the window, watching the street outside. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. She shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. "Old habits. When you live on the streets, you learn to always be aware of your surroundings." She paused, then added, "And sometimes, you're watching for someone who isn't coming back." The waitress returned with their coffee, and Angel wrapped her hands around the warm mug, seeming to draw comfort from its heat. "You're wondering how a nurse ended up homeless," she said quietly, meeting Richard's eyes directly for the first time. "I am," he admitted. "But more than that, I'm wondering how someone in your situation still carries medical supplies and helps others when most people would focus solely on their own survival." Angel took a sip of her coffee before responding. "Life doesn't always go as planned, does it? 3 years ago, I had everything, a good job at Memorial Hospital, a beautiful house, a loving husband." Her voice caught slightly. "Tom was a firefighter. We met when he brought in a burn victim, and I was the nurse on duty. He had this way of making everyone feel safe, even in the worst situations." She paused as the grilled cheese arrived, the melted cheese steaming slightly. Richard noticed how she cut it carefully in half, wrapping one portion in a napkin and slipping it into her pocket. Probably for someone else, he realized. "Tom died in a warehouse fire," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "He went back in for a trapped worker, and the floor collapsed. The insurance company found a technicality, something about the building's status and jurisdiction. They denied the claim. I spent everything we had on lawyers, trying to fight it, but..." She shrugged, the gesture containing years of exhaustion and defeat. "The medical bills from my own injury didn't help," she added, touching the scar above her eyebrow. "I'd been in a car accident a few months before, rushing to an emergency shift. The hospital covered some of it, but with the ongoing legal battles. Eventually, I couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. Then the hospital downsized, and my position was eliminated. Richard listened intently, his coffee growing cold and forgotten. But you kept your medical supplies, he observed. Angel's face brightened slightly. Knowledge and skills, those are things they can't take away from you. I figured if I couldn't work in a hospital anymore, I could still help people in my own way. There are so many on the streets who need medical attention but are afraid to go to hospitals or can't afford to. She pulled out her notebook, the one Richard had noticed earlier. I keep track of the elderly folks in our community, their medications, allergies. Sometimes I can convince the free clinic to help, sometimes local doctors who remember me from the hospital. It's not much, but it's everything to those you help, Richard finished for her. He thought about his own life, the billions in real estate developments, the endless meetings, the superficial relationships. When was the last time he'd made a real difference in someone's life? The soup kitchen, he said suddenly. How do they manage? Do they get enough donations? Angel's expression turned concerned. They do their best, but it's getting harder. Food prices keep rising, and there are more people needing help every week. Sister Catherine, who runs it, sometimes uses her own pension to buy supplies. Richard pulled out his business card, sliding it across the table. I'd like to help. Not just with donations, but maybe something more permanent. His mind was already working through possibilities, vacant properties that could be converted, resources that could be redirected. Angel picked up the card, her eyes widening as she read his title. You're that Richard Chen? The real estate developer? She started to slide the card back. I don't want you to feel obligated. This isn't obligation, Richard interrupted. This is recognition. Sometimes we get so caught up in building things that we forget about building communities. You reminded me of that today. As they finished their meal, Richard noticed Angel's fatigue, though she tried to hide it. Let me arrange a hotel room for you, he offered. But Angel shook her head firmly. Thank you, but no. There are people counting on me tonight. Mrs. Wu needs her blood pressure checked, and young Bobby's cough needs monitoring. She stood up, gathering her few belongings. Besides, my spot under the bridge isn't so bad. I can see the stars on clear nights. Richard watched her head toward the door, then called out, Angel, wait. She turned back. Tomorrow morning, would you be willing to show me? Show me what you see, who you help. I want to understand. Angel studied him for a long moment, perhaps searching for any sign of pity or condescension. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Meet me at the soup kitchen at 7. And Mr. Chen? Wear comfortable shoes. As Richard watched her disappear into the night, he realized that his life had shifted somehow. The development project that had seemed so crucial this morning now felt insignificant compared to the quiet courage he'd witnessed. He pulled out his phone, canceling his meetings for the next day. Tomorrow would be about seeing the city through different eyes, through Angel's eyes. The next morning arrived with a gentle drizzle that painted the city streets in glistening reflections. Richard arrived at the soup kitchen at 6:45 a.m., wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. He'd spent a restless night thinking about Angel's story and the hidden world she'd offered to show him. Angel was already there, helping Sister Catherine set up for breakfast. The elderly nun's eyes twinkled with curiosity when she saw Richard, but she asked no questions. Instead, she handed him an apron without ceremony. If you're here, you work, she said simply. For the next hour, Richard experienced a different kind of morning rush than he was used to. Instead of emails and phone calls, he served oatmeal and coffee to a steady stream of people. Angel moved through the crowd with practiced ease, checking on regulars, dispensing basic medical advice, and somehow making each person feel seen and valued. Ready for the rounds? Angel asked after the breakfast crowd thinned. She shouldered her backpack, which Richard now knew contained her precious medical supplies. "We'll start with Mrs. Wu." Their first stop was a small tent tucked behind an abandoned warehouse. Mrs. Wu, a tiny woman in her 70s, greeted Angel with a warm hug. Richard watched in amazement as Angel checked the elderly woman's blood pressure, reviewed her medications, and chatted with her in broken Mandarin, a skill she'd picked up from her patients. Mrs. Wu used to be a teacher in Shanghai, Angel explained as they left. She came here to live with her son, but he lost his job during the economic downturn. Now they both live here. He works 2 jobs but can't afford an apartment yet. She refuses to be a burden by asking for more help. Their next stop was a rusty van parked in a quiet alley. Inside, they found Bobby, a 12-year-old boy, and his mother Linda. Bobby's cough had improved, but Angel still listened to his chest with a stethoscope borrowed from a sympathetic clinic doctor. Linda lost her apartment after getting sick and missing too many shifts at the diner, Angel explained later. She keeps Bobby in school though, they use a friend's address. He's top of his class in math. As the morning progressed, Richard met more people, a veteran struggling with PTSD who Angel had helped connect with VA benefits, a young woman fleeing domestic violence whom Angel had guided to a shelter, an elderly couple who'd lost their retirement savings to a scam. Each person had a story, and each story challenged Richard's preconceptions about homelessness. Around noon, they stopped at a small community garden hidden between 2 buildings. To Richard's surprise, several of the people they'd met that morning were there, tending to vegetables and herbs. "We started this last spring," Angel explained, touching a tomato plant lovingly. "Sister Catherine convinced the property owner to let us use the space. It gives people purpose, and the fresh vegetables help with meals at the kitchen. Plus, working with plants can be healing." Richard looked at the garden with new eyes, seeing not just plants but a symbol of hope and community. "The property owner, would they be willing to sell?" he asked suddenly. Angel raised an eyebrow. "Probably. It's been marked for development for years, but nothing's happened." "Why?" "Because this." Richard gestured to the garden, then to the surrounding area they'd visited that morning. "All of this needs to be protected and expanded. These people don't just need handouts, they need a foundation to rebuild their lives." He pulled out his phone, quickly making notes. "This area could become a community center. We could have proper medical facilities, job training programs, transitional housing." He stopped, noticing Angel's expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said softly. "It's just, we've heard promises before. Politicians, developers, charity organizations, they all come with big plans, take some photos for publicity, and then disappear when they realize how complex the problems really are." Richard put his phone away, meeting her gaze. "I'm not here for publicity, Angel. You showed me something today that I can't unsee. All my life, I've built buildings, but you've shown me how to build community. These people trust you because you've earned it, day by day. I want to earn that trust too." Angel studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Start small," she advised. "Before you make big plans, spend more time here. Learn the rhythms of the community. Understand what people really need, not just what you think they need." As if to emphasize her point, a commotion arose from the street. They hurried out to find a young man collapsed on the sidewalk. Angel rushed forward, her medical training taking over. "It's just heat exhaustion and dehydration," she diagnosed, already pulling out supplies from her backpack. Richard watched her work, amazed at how the crowd naturally organized itself to help, one person running for water, another providing shade with a piece of cardboard, a third fanning the young man with a newspaper. This wasn't just a group of homeless people, it was a community taking care of its own. As the young man recovered, Richard made a decision. "Angel," he said, "would you be willing to work with me? Not just as a guide, but as a partner. You know this community, you understand their needs, and most importantly, they trust you. Together, we could create something sustainable here. Angel helped the young man sit up before turning to Richard. Why? Why would a successful businessman want to get involved in all this? Richard thought about his empty penthouse apartment, his superficial business relationships, the hollow feeling of success that had been gnawing at him lately. Because yesterday, when you helped me up from that sidewalk, you didn't see a wealthy businessman, you just saw someone who needed help. That's what this community does every day, isn't it? They help each other, share what little they have, look out for one another. I want to be part of that. A small smile crossed Angel's face. Come back tomorrow, she said. And the day after that. Show them you mean it. Show them you're not just another person making empty promises. Do that, and we'll talk about partnership. As they walked back toward the soup kitchen, Richard noticed Angel checking her notebook again. Another patient to see? He asked. Always, she replied. There's a pregnant woman living in her car behind the old factory. She needs prenatal vitamins and a proper checkup. She hesitated, then added, would you like to come along? Richard looked at his watch. He had 3 missed calls and numerous unread emails. For the first time in his career, none of it seemed important. Lead the way, he said, and followed Angel down the street, ready to learn more about the invisible city that existed alongside his own. Over the next few weeks, Richard became a familiar face in the community. True to his word, he returned day after day, not as a wealthy observer but as an active participant. He learned the stories behind every face, helped serve meals at the soup kitchen, and even started keeping his own notebook of ideas and observations. One morning, as Richard helped distribute breakfast, he noticed Angel looking more tired than usual. She was sitting at a corner table, her medical supplies spread out before her, trying to make them last. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted bandages. When was the last time you slept properly? He asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Angel gave a weary smile. The pregnant woman I told you about, Rose, she went into labor last night. We got her to the hospital just in time. She rubbed her eyes. She named her baby Hope. Fitting, isn't it? Richard watched as she methodically repacked her supplies. Over the past weeks, he'd seen how she stretched every resource, often going without food herself to ensure others had enough. The sight stirred something in him, a mix of admiration and frustration at a system that forced such choices. I've been thinking, he said carefully, about what you said about starting small and earning trust. I think I'm ready to take the first step, but I need your help. Angel looked up, curious. What kind of step? Richard pulled out a folder from his bag. There's a building 2 blocks from here, an old medical clinic that's been empty for years. I bought it yesterday. He spread out the plans on the table. With some renovation, it could become a proper medical center for the community. Not just for emergencies, but for preventive care, regular checkups, maternal health. Angel's eyes widened as she studied the plans. This would take significant resources, not just for renovation but for staffing, supplies. I've thought about that, Richard continued. I've already spoken to some of my business contacts. 3 hospitals have agreed to provide rotating volunteer staff, and 2 pharmaceutical companies will donate supplies. But... He paused, meeting her eyes, we need someone to run it. Someone who knows this community, who understands their needs, who they trust. Angel sat back, realization dawning on her face. Me? Richard, I haven't practiced nursing officially in years. My license can be reinstated, he finished. I've checked. With your experience and a brief refresher course, you can be recertified. The clinic would provide you with housing above the facility, you'd be on site for emergencies anyway. Plus, we could hire some of the community members for support staff positions. Give them a chance to rebuild their lives too. Tears welled up in Angel's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. It sounds too good to be true, she whispered. It won't be easy, Richard admitted. We'll face bureaucratic hurdles, funding challenges, skepticism from both the business community and the people we're trying to help. But together. He reached across the table, touching her worn notebook. Together, we can make this work. Just then, Sister Catherine approached their table, carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, setting the cups down. And I think it's about time someone recognized Angel's work properly. She turned to Angel with a gentle smile. My dear, you've been an angel to this community for so long. Perhaps this is God's way of being an angel to you. Angel touched her wedding ring, a habit Richard had noticed she had when making important decisions. Tom always said that everything happens for a reason, she said softly. Maybe meeting you wasn't just about preventing a fall. Sleep on it, Richard suggested, standing up. The choice has to be yours. But first. He gestured to the door where Bobby and his mother Linda had just entered, looking anxious. I think you have some patients waiting. As Angel went to attend to them, Richard observed how naturally she transitioned into her role as caregiver. Despite her exhaustion, her movements were sure, her voice gentle but professional. She was already everything this clinic would need, she just needed the proper platform to expand her reach. Later that afternoon, Richard received an unexpected call from his office. His assistant sounded worried. Sir, the board members are asking questions. They've heard rumors about you buying property in the downtown area for non-commercial use. They're concerned about the company's direction. Richard looked out the soup kitchen window, watching Angel teach a young volunteer how to properly check blood pressure. Schedule a board meeting for tomorrow morning, he replied. It's time they understood that business success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. When he hung up, he noticed Angel approaching with a determined look in her eyes. I've been thinking about your offer, she said, sitting down beside him. If we do this, I have conditions. Richard nodded, pulling out his notebook. I'm listening. First, the clinic needs to be accessible to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. Second, we need to train and hire people from the community whenever possible. Third, we maintain the soup kitchen and garden program, they're vital parts of this community's support system. As she listed her conditions, Richard smiled, noting how she said, we, instead of, you. She was already thinking like a partner, not just a recipient of charity. There's one more thing, Angel added, her voice softening. In the clinic, I want a wall dedicated to Tom. Not just to honor him, but to remind everyone that circumstances can change in an instant, that anyone can find themselves needing help. And that helping others is the best way to honor those we've lost. Richard felt the weight of her words. He thought about how different his life had been just weeks ago, how close he'd come to missing this opportunity to make a real difference. We'll call it the Thomas Memorial Clinic, he said. A place of healing for both body and spirit. Angel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. Then yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'll help you build this. Not just the clinic, but everything else we've talked about, the job training programs, the transitional housing, the community center. But we do it right, we do it gradually, and we do it together. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Richard watched the soup kitchen buzzing with its usual activity. Sister Catherine was teaching a young man how to make soup in bulk. Mrs. Wu was helping Bobby with his math homework. The pregnant woman, Rose, had returned with her newborn, surrounded by community members cooing over the baby. This, he realized, was what real wealth looked like, not the numbers in his bank account or the properties in his portfolio, but the richness of human connection, the strength of a community supporting each other through hard times. Together, he agreed, shaking Angel's hand to seal their partnership. As they did, baby Hope let out a tiny cry, making everyone laugh. It felt like a new beginning, not just for Angel and Richard, but for the entire community. The renovation of the old medical clinic progressed steadily through the autumn months. Richard's construction teams worked alongside community members who'd been hired for the project, creating a sense of ownership and pride in the building's transformation. Angel, meanwhile, threw herself into refresher courses to reinstate her nursing license, studying late into the night in her temporary office at the soup kitchen. One chilly morning, as workers installed the clinic's new windows, Richard arrived to find Angel deep in conversation with a group of people he didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits that stood out sharply against the neighborhood's backdrop. City council members, Angel explained later, as they walked through the half-finished clinic rooms. They're concerned about the impact on the neighborhood. Some wealthy developers have been complaining that our project will decrease property values. She sighed, adjusting a crooked doorframe. They don't understand that lifting people up raises the value of the entire community. Richard nodded, thinking about his own board meeting weeks earlier. He'd faced similar resistance until he'd shown them the numbers, how community investment could actually increase long-term property values, how social responsibility could attract better business partners, how small investments in people could yield massive returns in community stability. Let them worry, he said, watching a former homeless man named Joe carefully install new lighting fixtures. We'll prove them wrong with results, not arguments. The next few weeks brought both progress and challenges. The clinic's medical equipment arrived, donated by hospitals that had heard about their initiative. Local medical students volunteered to help set up the systems, excited about the opportunity to serve the community. But they also faced setbacks, permit delays, budget overruns, and occasional vandalism from those who didn't want the neighborhood to change. Through it all, Angel remained the heart of the project. Even as she studied for her recertification exams, she continued her daily rounds, keeping the community's trust alive. Her patient list had grown, and she'd started training other community members in basic healthcare skills. One evening, as they reviewed the clinic's opening timeline, an urgent knock interrupted them. It was Linda, Bobby's mother, looking panicked. "It's Mrs. Wu," she gasped. "She's having chest pains." They rushed to Mrs. Wu's tent, finding the elderly woman pale and frightened. Angel immediately took charge, checking vital signs while Richard called an ambulance. As they waited, Angel held Mrs. Wu's hand, speaking soothingly in her mixture of English and Mandarin. "This is why we need the clinic," Angel said later, after Mrs. Wu had been stabilized at the hospital. She'd been rationing her heart medication because she couldn't afford the full prescription. "With regular checkups and proper medication management, we could prevent emergencies like this." Richard stayed at the hospital with Mrs. Wu's son while Angel made her evening rounds. Watching the worried son hold his mother's hand, Richard thought about how health and poverty were intertwined, how one medical emergency could devastate a family's stability. When he finally left the hospital, he found Angel at the construction site, sitting on the clinic's front steps. She was holding her wedding ring, lost in thought. "Tom would be proud of you," Richard said softly, sitting beside her. Angel smiled, wiping away a tear. "I had a dream about him last night." He was standing in the clinic, in his firefighter uniform, smiling. "In the dream," he said, "you finally found your way home." She looked at the building behind them. "This place, it's becoming more than just a clinic, isn't it?" Richard understood what she meant. Over the past months, he'd watched as the project evolved beyond its original scope. The community garden had expanded, with local restaurants now buying their produce. Sister Catherine had started a cooking class, teaching nutrition alongside basic culinary skills. The construction workers were teaching their trade to interested community members, creating an informal apprenticeship program. "We're building hope," he replied. "One brick at a time." The next morning brought unexpected news. The local newspaper had run a story about their project, featuring interviews with community members whose lives had been touched by Angel's work. The article highlighted the unique partnership between a successful businessman and a former nurse who'd experienced homelessness herself. The response was immediate. Calls flooded in from other businesses wanting to contribute, from medical professionals offering to volunteer, from community organizations seeking to replicate their model. Even some of the skeptical city council members reached out, asking for tours of the facility. "It's overwhelming," Angel admitted, sorting through the messages. "We need to be careful not to lose our focus. These people trusted us when we had nothing to offer but care and respect. We can't let growth change that." Richard agreed. Together, they drafted guidelines for expanding their services, maintain personal connections, involve the community in decision-making, prioritize dignity and independence, and never forget their original mission, to help people rebuild their lives. As the clinic's opening day approached, they faced an unexpected crisis. The medical supplies supplier suddenly backed out, citing budget constraints. The setback threatened to delay their opening by months. But then something remarkable happened. Word spread through the community about the problem. Mrs. Wu's son, now back at work, reached out to his contacts in the medical supply industry. Bobby's mother Linda, who'd recently found employment at a local hospital, spoke to her supervisors. Even the street vendor who'd first directed Richard to Angel knew someone who knew someone. Within days, they had new suppliers, better terms, and additional support they hadn't even asked for. The community they'd worked so hard to help was now helping them back. "See?" Angel said, watching volunteers unload the new supplies. "This is what real community looks like. Everyone has something to contribute, something to teach, something to give." Richard looked around at the scene before them. The clinic was nearly ready, its fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight. The garden was thriving, tended by a mix of homeless individuals and local residents. The soup kitchen had become a community hub, offering not just meals but classes, support groups, and a sense of belonging. But most importantly, he saw the people. Mrs. Wu, recovered and helping to organize medical records. Bobby, doing his homework while his mother trained as a clinic receptionist. The construction workers who'd stayed on as maintenance staff, teaching their skills to others. Sister Catherine, coordinating volunteers with her quiet efficiency. And Angel, standing in the middle of it all, her medical notebook now replaced with proper patient files, her worn backpack exchanged for a professional medical bag, but her gentle spirit unchanged. "You know," Richard said, watching a group of medical students arrive for their orientation, "when you caught me that morning, you didn't just prevent a fall. You showed me how to rise, how we all can rise together." Angel touched the clinic sign, her fingers tracing the words, "Thomas Memorial Clinic," with tenderness. "Tom used to say that sometimes the worst things in life lead us to the best things," she said. "I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters." The morning of the clinic's opening dawned bright and clear. Angel stood in her new apartment above the facility, adjusting her freshly pressed nurse's uniform. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned on her name badge, Angel Chen, RN, Clinical Director. The new surname had been Richard's suggestion, a way to honor their partnership and give her back a sense of identity she'd lost on the streets. Below, a small crowd had already gathered. Not just community members, but local officials, medical professionals, and media representatives. Richard was there too, looking unusually nervous as he checked and rechecked the opening ceremony arrangements. "Everything needs to be perfect," he muttered when Angel joined him. "These people deserve perfect." Angel touched his arm gently. "What they deserve is what we've already given them, respect and hope. The rest is just details." The ceremony began with Sister Catherine's blessing. As she spoke about community and healing, Angel noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Rose was there with baby Hope, now a chubby 3-month-old. Mrs. Wu sat in the front row, her son beside her, both beaming with pride. Bobby, wearing a new shirt for the occasion, held a hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you Angel and Mr. Chen." When it was time for speeches, Richard stepped forward first. But instead of the formal address everyone expected, he simply said, "3 months ago, I was a man who thought success meant building the tallest buildings and making the biggest profits. Then I fell, literally and figuratively, and an angel caught me." He paused, looking at Angel. "She showed me that true success isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched and communities strengthened." As applause filled the air, a commotion arose from the back of the crowd. A young man was pushing through, supporting an elderly woman who was struggling to breathe. Angel immediately switched into nurse mode, rushing forward with her medical bag, the same one she'd carried on the streets. "Inside, quickly," she directed, leading them through the clinic's new doors. The crowd watched in amazement as Angel and her newly trained staff worked seamlessly together, getting the woman oxygen and stabilizing her condition. "Asthma attack," Angel explained when she returned outside. "She'll be fine." Looking at the gathered officials and reporters, she added, "This is what we're here for. Not ribbons and speeches, but helping people when they need it most." The unexpected incident proved to be the perfect demonstration of the clinic's importance. City council members who had been skeptical now nodded in approval. Reporters scribbled notes about the quick, professional response. But most importantly, the community members saw that their new clinic was real, functional, and truly there for them. As the day progressed, Angel gave tours of the facility. She showed off the modern examination rooms, the well-stocked pharmacy, the comfortable waiting area decorated with local artists' work. But her favorite spot was the memorial wall, where Tom's firefighter photograph hung alongside stories of community members who'd overcome adversity. "This wall will grow," she explained to visitors. "Every person who comes here has a story of struggle and strength. We want to honor those stories." Richard, meanwhile, was in deep conversation with other business leaders who'd attended the opening. "This isn't charity," he told them firmly. "It's investment in human potential. Look around, every person here has something to contribute if given the chance." He pointed out Joe, the former homeless man who'd helped with construction and was now the clinic's maintenance supervisor. Linda, who'd expanded her receptionist duties to include patient advocacy. Even Bobby had a role, helping younger children with homework in the clinic's small study area while their parents received care. By late afternoon, the crowds had thinned, but the clinic remained busy with its first day of regular patients. Angel moved efficiently between rooms, her years of street medicine experience blending seamlessly with modern medical practice. In a quiet moment, she found Richard sitting in the garden, watching the sunset paint the clinic's walls in golden light. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, joining him. "I was thinking about legacy," he replied. "All those luxury apartments and office buildings I've built, they'll stand for decades, maybe centuries. But this..." He gestured to the clinic, the garden, the people still milling about. "This is the kind of legacy that lives in people's hearts." Angel understood. She'd been thinking about legacy too, about Tom's sacrifice, about her own journey from success to homelessness and back to a different kind of success. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "This is just the beginning." She pulled out a folder filled with letters from other communities, requests to help them set up similar programs. People are seeing that it's possible to make real change when business success meets social responsibility. They want to learn from us. Richard nodded, already formulating plans. "We could create a foundation, provide guidance and initial funding to help other communities replicate this model." "But..." He looked at Angel questioningly. "But we stay focused here first," she finished his thought. "Make sure this works perfectly before we try to expand. These people trusted us when we were just a dream. We owe them our full attention until we're sure everything is running smoothly." As if to emphasize her point, Sister Catherine appeared with a concerned look. "The Peterson family is here," she said softly. "All 5 children have bad colds, and they've been sleeping in their car since last week." Angel immediately stood up, her face determined. "Get them registered, start them on the housing assistance program, and have Linda contact the shelter network. I'll examine the children." She turned to Richard. "Coming?" Richard smiled, following her back into the clinic. This was what it was all about, not the grand opening ceremony or the media attention, but the daily work of helping people, one family at a time. Inside, they found Bobby teaching the youngest Peterson child how to use the hand sanitizer while Linda gently took down the family's information. Mrs. Wu had appeared with thermoses of hot soup, and Joe was already discussing temporary maintenance work with Mr. Peterson. "Look at this," Angel whispered to Richard as they watched the scene unfold. "The community isn't just receiving help anymore, they're becoming the helpers. That's real transformation." As the evening settled in, the clinic's lights glowed warmly, a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. The sign reading, "Thomas Memorial Clinic," cast a gentle shadow, reminding everyone that from personal tragedy could come community triumph. Angel's last patient of the day was a young woman, newly homeless, her eyes filled with the same fear and shame Angel remembered from her own early days on the street. As she treated the woman's infected foot, Angel shared her own story, watching hope slowly replace fear in the woman's eyes. "You're not alone anymore," Angel told her, writing out a treatment plan. "You found your way home, we all have." 6 months after the clinic's opening, winter had settled over the city. The garden lay dormant under a blanket of snow, but inside the Thomas Memorial Clinic, life flourished with warmth and purpose. The waiting room buzzed with activity as Angel reviewed patient files at the front desk, her face glowing with quiet satisfaction. "We've helped over 300 families so far," she told Richard during their weekly meeting. "Not just with medical care, but with housing assistance, job placement, and education support." She pulled up a spreadsheet on her tablet, a far cry from her old worn notebook. 87 people have found permanent housing, and 53 have secured full-time employment. Richard nodded, equally pleased but already thinking ahead. "The city council approved our proposal for the abandoned warehouse next door. We can start renovating it into transitional housing units next month." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face, Rose, with baby Hope now crawling and babbling. But this time, Rose wasn't coming as a patient. She'd recently completed a medical assistant training program and was starting her first day as part of the clinic staff. "Life has a way of coming full circle," Angel remarked as she watched Rose don her new uniform. A year ago, she was living in her car, pregnant and scared. Now she's helping others while supporting her daughter. The clinic had become more than just a medical facility, it was a hub of transformation. The study area where Bobby once did his homework had evolved into a full-fledged education center, offering GED classes and computer training. Linda had been promoted to program coordinator, overseeing a team of community outreach workers. Even Mrs. Wu had found her purpose, running a support group for elderly immigrants and teaching basic English classes. Her son had been promoted at work, allowing them to move into a small apartment, but they still came to the clinic daily to volunteer. One snowy afternoon, as Angel made her rounds, she found Richard in deep conversation with a group of business leaders from other cities. They'd heard about the clinic's success and wanted to learn from their model. "The key," Richard was explaining, "is that we didn't just provide services, we created opportunities for people to rebuild their dignity and self-worth. Every person who comes through those doors is treated not as a charity case, but as a potential contributor to the community." Later, Angel found him standing before Tom's photo on the memorial wall. "You know what I realized," he said without turning around. "When we started this, I thought I was the one with resources to give. But this community, these people, they had resources I never imagined. Resilience, compassion, wisdom, they just needed a platform to share them." Angel touched Tom's photograph gently. He used to say that everyone has a light inside them. Sometimes it gets dimmed by circumstances, but it never goes out completely. All it takes is someone believing in them to help that light shine again. Their reflection was interrupted by an urgent call. A fire had broken out in a nearby homeless encampment. Angel grabbed her emergency kit, muscle memory from her street days taking over. Richard was right behind her, no longer the impeccably dressed businessman but a committed community member ready to help. At the scene, they found Joe already there, using his maintenance skills to help control the fire before it spread. The clinic's emergency response team, trained for such situations, worked efficiently to treat smoke inhalation and minor burns. "We need to get everyone inside," Angel decided, looking at the destroyed tents and belongings. "The community center can serve as temporary shelter." Without hesitation, Richard made calls to arrange transportation and supplies. The soup kitchen staff, led by Sister Catherine, quickly organized hot meals. Local residents, many of whom had once been skeptical of the clinic, brought blankets and warm clothing. As they worked through the night to help the displaced individuals, Angel noticed something remarkable. Among the volunteers were many former clinic patients, now stable enough to help others in crisis. The cycle of compassion had come full circle. By morning, every person from the encampment had a warm place to sleep and a plan for next steps. The clinic's housing coordinator was already working to find permanent solutions, while the job placement team prepared to help those ready for employment. "This is what we dreamed of," Angel told Richard as they finally took a break, watching the sunrise through the clinic's windows. "Not just treating symptoms, but creating lasting change." Richard smiled, remembering his own transformation. "You know, I used to measure success in profit margins and property values. Now I measure it in stories like Rose's, in moments like last night when the community came together." The clinic's influence had begun to spread beyond their neighborhood. Other cities were studying their model, asking for guidance in setting up similar programs. Angel and Richard had started a small consulting team, staffed entirely by program graduates, to help other communities replicate their success. But they never lost sight of their core mission. Every morning, Angel still made rounds, not just in the clinic but in the streets, reaching out to those not yet ready to come inside. Richard continued to attend every community meeting, listening more than speaking, learning from those he once would have overlooked. The Peterson family, who had come to the clinic on opening day with sick children, had become one of their success stories. Mr. Peterson now worked as a security guard at the clinic, while Mrs. Peterson had discovered a talent for grant writing and helped secure funding for new programs. One day, as Angel was updating the memorial wall with new success stories, a young medical student approached her. "I read about you in medical school," the student said shyly. "About how you went from being homeless to running this clinic. You're the reason I wanted to do my rotation here." Angel was taken aback, not realizing her story had traveled so far. "The clinic's success isn't about me," she replied. "It's about everyone who believed in second chances, including themselves." Later, she shared the encounter with Richard. "It's strange," she mused. "When I was on the streets, I thought I'd lost everything. But now I see that experience gave me exactly what I needed to help others find their way back." Richard looked around the bustling clinic, at the lives being changed and the community growing stronger. "Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this," he said. "Sometimes we have to fall to learn how to help others rise. Sometimes we have to lose our way to find our true purpose." Outside, the snow had started falling again, but inside the Thomas Memorial Clinic, warmth and hope continued to grow, one life at a time. 1 year to the day after Richard's fall on the sidewalk, the Thomas Memorial Clinic hosted a community celebration. The once empty lot had transformed into a thriving campus, with the clinic at its heart, surrounded by the transitional housing complex, the expanded community garden, and the education center. Angel stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. She wore her nurse's uniform, but pinned to it was something new, an award from the city for outstanding community service. Yet her proudest achievement wasn't the recognition, but the faces she saw before her. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I was known as the angel of these streets, trying to help others while hiding my own struggles. Today, I look around and see angels everywhere, in each person who lifts up another, in every hand extended in friendship rather than charity." The audience included faces both familiar and new. Baby Hope, now walking, toddled between the chairs while Rose kept a watchful eye while taking notes. She'd recently been accepted to nursing school. Mrs. Wu sat with her knitting group, their handmade blankets now warming beds in the transitional housing units. Bobby, having skipped 2 grades thanks to the education center's support, was teaching younger kids how to use the new computers. Richard sat in the front row, looking different from the rushed businessman of a year ago. The sharp suits remained, but his eyes had softened, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd found his true purpose. Beside him sat Sister Catherine, her quiet smile reflecting the pride of seeing her soup kitchen's mission expand beyond her wildest dreams. "When we started this journey," Angel continued, "people asked us what success would look like. Would it be the number of patients treated? The families housed? The jobs secured?" She paused, looking at the memorial wall, now expanded to cover an entire corridor with stories of transformation. "But we've learned that success isn't in the numbers, it's in the moments of dignity restored, in the rekindling of hope, in the strength of a community that lifts itself up." As if to emphasize her point, Joe stood up from his seat. He'd recently been promoted to facilities director for all their properties, and was now training others in building maintenance. "A year ago," he called out, "I was sleeping under a bridge. Now I have keys to every building here, because someone trusted me with more than just a handout. They trusted me with a future." The celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up in the garden. The Peterson family, now running their own catering business, had prepared the feast. Local musicians, many of whom had found their way to the clinic during hard times, provided entertainment. Richard found Angel by the memorial wall, where she stood looking at Tom's photograph. "He would be so proud," Richard said softly. Angel nodded, touching her wedding ring, now accompanied by a new ring, her medical license renewal ring. "You know what's amazing? Every story on this wall, including mine, started with someone reaching out. Sometimes it was for help, sometimes to help others, but it always started with connection." They watched as Linda organized a group of new volunteers, former patients now giving back to the community that had helped them. The clinic's model had proven so successful that they'd opened 2 more locations across the city, each run by graduates of their programs. "Remember when you said we had to start small and earn trust?" Richard asked, smiling at the memory. "You were right. Building this wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about showing up every day, listening more than talking, and believing in people's potential." A commotion near the garden drew their attention. One of their newest residents, an elderly man who'd lived in his car for 3 years, had just received keys to his transitional housing apartment. The look of disbelief and joy on his face reminded Angel of her own journey. "That moment," she whispered, "when someone realizes they're not alone anymore, that's what makes all of this worth it." The evening's highlight came when Bobby took the stage. The once shy boy had become a confident young speaker, representing the youth program at community events. "My mom and I," he began, "we used to think we were alone in our struggles. But this place showed us that no one has to face hard times alone. Now, my mom helps other families navigate the system, and I'm heading to college next year on a scholarship." As applause filled the air, Richard leaned over to Angel. "Speaking of education, the board approved our proposal. The Scholarship Foundation will be fully funded, helping more kids like Bobby achieve their dreams." Angel smiled, remembering how Richard had once measured success in property values and profit margins. Now he evaluated it in changed lives and renewed hope. His business empire hadn't suffered, in fact, it had grown as other companies sought to partner with his socially responsible initiatives. As the celebration wound down, Angel made her final rounds of the evening, a habit she'd never lost from her street medicine days. In the clinic's waiting room, now adorned with community artwork, she found a young woman sitting quietly, clutching a backpack similar to the one Angel had carried during her homeless days. "We're actually closed for the celebration," Angel said gently, sitting beside her. The woman nodded but didn't move. "I've been watching this place for weeks," she admitted. "I saw how people come in broken and leave standing taller. I didn't think I deserved help." Angel recognized the shame in her voice, she'd carried it herself once. "Everyone deserves help," she said firmly. "But more than that, everyone deserves the chance to help others. Sometimes we have to accept help first to learn how to give it." As she helped the woman register for their programs, Angel caught sight of her reflection in the window. She barely recognized herself from a year ago, not because of the uniform or the award pin, but because of the purpose that radiated from within. Outside, the garden lights twinkled under the stars. Richard was showing a group of business leaders around, no doubt inspiring them to start similar programs in their own cities. Sister Catherine led an evening prayer group in the community center. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the transitional housing complex. "Welcome home," Angel told the young woman, handing her an intake form. "Your story matters here." Later that night, after the celebrations ended and the last guests departed, Angel and Richard stood in the clinic's doorway, looking out at their thriving community. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "when you caught me that day, you didn't just save me from a fall. You showed me how to rise, and in rising, how to help others rise too." Angel smiled, thinking of all the lives touched, all the stories yet to be written on their memorial wall. "Sometimes," she replied, "the greatest miracles start with a simple act of kindness. Everything else is just people believing in each other enough to keep that kindness going." As they turned off the clinic's lights, the sign, "Thomas Memorial Clinic," glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone seeking a second chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to help. But for now, they could rest knowing that what had started with a fall had grown into something that helped countless others rise.